So, Dr. S. Jaishankar, India's External Affairs Minister, making a big statement today in front of Parliament in the Lok Sabha, saying that India and China have completed their disengagement on the line of actual control. This comes after a deal that was struck between India and China in late October for disengagement on in particular parts of the line of actual control, which is the disputed boundary that India and China share in places like Depsang and Demchok. You might remember that after the India-China border standoff broke out, there were standoffs in particular parts of the LAC, but Depsang and Demchok were two places that did not get resolved. Other parts of the LAC disengagement, which is a pullback of military forces, was achieved, but not in these two particular parts of the line of actual control. On October 21st, the External Affairs Minister of India, S. Jaishankar, announced that a deal had been reached on this question, and now we are being informed by the External Affairs Minister, by Dr. S. Jaishankar, that full disengagement has taken place and the resumption of patrolling rights has also begun. Remember that India, one of the big contentions was that China in 2020 sent thousands and thousands of troops to move across the line of actual control into territories that India claimed as part of its territory and blocked access to particular parts of patrolling points that India generally had access to on the line of actual control. This access now presumably has been restored with this deal between India and China, and Dr. Jaishankar clarifying that in fact resumption of patrolling is underway by the two militaries, and also pointing out that in other parts of the LAC as well, where there was friction, some considered solutions have been put forward and have been adopted. So now we're seeing that disengagement on the India-China border that had been announced or talked about just a month or two ago has now been completed in a step that could have major ramifications for India and China relations. Let's just get into what exactly Dr. Jaishankar said. So he said, first and foremost, he began by explaining to the parliamentarians something of the history between India and China on the border, pointing out to parliamentarians that China is in illegal occupation of territory that India claims as its own in Aksai Chin. This includes almost 40,000 square kilometers of territory. Also, talking about how Pakistan also in the 1960s handed territory that India claims as its own, the Shaksgam Valley, to China. This is again in something that India contests and has contested for several decades now. So he laid out that history, he laid out what the line of actual control is, which is that it is a boundary between India and China, but there are significant disagreements in parts of the border as to where the line of actual control lies, and that is at the genesis, the heart of the border dispute between India and China. So he explained this history, explained what happened in 2020 when thousands of Chinese troops, who India believed were in the region for military exercises. These people moved in large numbers, thousands of troops, across the line of actual control and blocked India's access to territories that it generally patrolled. Remember, both sides have differing perceptions of the line of actual control, and in the 1990s, a border peace and tranquility agreement was agreed to, which allowed both sides to patrol up to in a certain way to areas that they claimed as their own. It was a measure to restore stability on the India-China border to ensure that there were no conflicts like there were in 1962. So these agreements were then breached, these protocols were breached in areas like the Gogra Hot Springs, Depsang, Demchok, in numerous points across across Ladakh, and of course in the line of actual control. Over the course of several years after that, there was disengagement in particular parts, for example, like Gogra Hot Springs and so on, but bilateral relations were completely impacted by what had happened in the middle of 2020. The relations were frozen. There were barriers to investments put up from China. There were also various measures taken against Chinese apps that was also which were banned in India. There was also a pronounced desire on India's part to suspend political engagement at high levels with the Chinese government, saying very, very clearly that unless we see some movement on the border and a restoration of stability and the status quo on the border, we are not going to be engaging with China. We are not going to take this lying down. We are going to push back. There were some counter deployments of the Indian military as well, and so what you saw was tens of thousands of troops for years on end locked in this border stalemate in with China. The diplomatic relationship was completely frozen. Diplomatic ties were also extremely strained for 4 years. Now, all of that context Dr. Jaishankar gave his parliamentary colleagues and then said that resumption of patrols in the line of actual control is underway. Disengagement has been achieved in full in Depsang and Demchok, which is the two areas, as I was saying, that have not that were not earlier part of disengagement deals. Now disengagement has taken place, and both sides have now resumed their regular patrolling rights. Now, this is the first step in a multi-stage process that will involve both countries continuing to work together to ensure that there is, after disengagement, there is de-escalation and de-induction of forces, which essentially is a lot of jargon to mean that troops, of course, there were tens of thousands of troops that were inducted into this theater, this strategic theater in Ladakh and for China towards its southern border. These troops will need to pull further back, and then they will have to leave and go back to their original postings as well to ensure that there is longer term stability on the border. So that is something that was a major statement that Dr. Jaishankar has made. He thanked the Indian military forces for their competence, for their professionalism, for counter-deploying extremely quickly to meet the Chinese threat, and also pointed out that the Indian military as well as India's foreign service have worked extremely closely to ensure that there was a lockstep arrangement when it came to dealing with the Chinese, both on the ground as well as at the diplomatic negotiating table. He also pointed out there has been intensive diplomacy over the last couple of years between India and China in terms of meeting, whether it is by commanders on the ground as well as senior military leaders, as well as between the working groups at the level of the foreign ministry. And then, of course, we saw a series of important meetings between India and China, especially Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar and the Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi. And that has produced this breakthrough that we saw on October 21st, that announcement of that deal. And now, of course, now what we are seeing is an agreement now that the two sides have, in fact, resumed their patrolling duties as they did in the past, as well as a full disengagement in eastern Ladakh. So that's what we're seeing right now. Of course, another important thing that I would be remiss if I did not mention was another big takeaway. What does this mean for the future of India-China relations? That was something that Jaishankar also addressed, and he said that the conclusion of disengagement allows us to consider other areas of bilateral engagement in a calibrated manner in accordance with our national interest. What that means is that having concluded the disengagement on the line of actual control, the two sides will, of course, now look to pull forces further back and de-induct them. But at the same time, what Dr. Jaishankar is hinting at is that there could be a broader normalization of India-China relations, something that China has been asking for a very, very long time. India has so far held firm on its stance that you have to fix the border first before we can normalize ties. But now that the disengagement deal is done, India, in accordance with its own national interest, will consider restarting some parts of the bilateral relationship with China. One example, of course, that has been on the minds of a lot of people is on economics. India has, as I said before, placed certain restrictions on Chinese investments coming into India. It has restricted visas for Chinese professionals coming into India. In particular, industries like telecom, renewable energy, those restrictions have been a problem, and the repeated refrain has been that, look, there needs to be a balance between economics, investment, and national security. That India, of course, needs and wants foreign investment into its economy. It wants to be part of global supply chains, but global supply chains depend so much on China that you also need to be part of China's supply chain. That has been the argument from a lot of business groups as well as a lot of economic ministries. There have been ministers, of course, talking about the fact that, including Piyush Goyal, coming out and saying that, look, national security is also extremely important. We have to maintain that. We cannot have key sectors of our economy to be dependent on Chinese interests, and we, of course, cannot compromise our broader diplomatic position by giving an inch to China without a resolution on the border. But now, Dr. Jaishankar is sort of talking about, in this statement, the conclusion of disengagement will allow other areas of bilateral engagement to proceed in accordance with our national interests. That, of course, is also something that India has made clear in the past, which is why the moment I read the statement, it reminded me of the economic side of the relationship, because that relationship between, we will allow investment from China, but it has to be in accordance with India's national interests. We cannot jeopardize India's national security. So that is something that we've heard much more closely, that we could restart economic engagement with China, but we will have to keep that lens of national interest in mind. So those are the big takeaways from Dr. Jaishankar's big statement in front of the Lok Sabha today. He was supposed to make that statement about yesterday, but then Parliament was disrupted, as it has for the last week or so. But now today, the External Affairs Minister making this important statement on India-China relations, apprising the House and apprising the Indian public about what has been going on in terms of the India-China relationship. We will keep you absolutely updated on this story, and we will also try to get you some interesting insights and views from India's foremost China experts on what exactly this deal would mean for India, as well as China, as well as for the future of the relationship between these two Asian titans. Thank you so much for watching us here on India Today Global. And as I said before, we will keep you updated on this story, as well as other breaking story news, including what's happening in Bangladesh here on India Today Global. Thank you.